Hi, this is Ben Kissling, and this is episode 8 of my video series on William Lane Craig and Genesis. I've been critiquing from a young Earth creationist perspective Dr. Craig's video and lecture series called Defenders 3 Excursus on Creation of Life and Biological Diversity. Last episode 7 was quite a while ago, and it was on parts 15 and 16 of Craig's series, which is over the biblical chronologies of Genesis 5 and 10 and 11. So that's a really important one and a crucial point of difference between young Earth creationism and old Earth creationism, which is Craig's position. But originally, I was planning on doing this episode as part of episode 7, and I started to realize this topic of aging in the flood is huge, and there's a lot to be said here. And so I thought I was going to be able to do it like a week after episode 7, but it's now been something like 2 months. So I got tired of trying to fit all these episodes, all the stuff I wanted to say into one episode, so I'm actually going to split it up again into 3 separate episodes. So just understand that these next 3 episodes are kind of meant to all go together. This episode will be pretty short, and it's really just going back to a couple of things that I need to cover from episode 6 that I did not cover in episode 6. Episode 9 will be the main one about aging in the flood, and episode 10 will be interesting excursus, if you will, on a couple of creation science theories that I think do affect why human ages declined after the flood, and then I'm going to give a novel interpretation of Genesis 6. So I realized in episode 6 that I neglected to address the most important young Earth creationist argument that something happened at the fall. I take a uncommon position among young Earth creationists about what happened at the fall. So you really, if you haven't seen episode 6, you really need to go back and watch episode 6. Basically, most young Earth creationists say that something happened, or God changed natural law somehow when Adam and Eve sinned, that allowed death and decay in nature to occur at the fall. And in episode 6, I made a lot of arguments from the New Testament and from science, but I realized that that the main argument that young Earth creationists make is the language in Genesis 1, where God says at the end of the sixth day of creation, God says He looked at all that He had made and it was very good. And the claim is that because the original creation was very good, it could not have included even the possibility of death or any kind of running down or wear and tear on creation. And then young Earth creationists generally use this as an argument against old Earth creation by saying old Earth creationism requires death to exist prior to the fall. I argued that God can include death and decay in the original creation because He is outside of time. And yeah, so, but they still say that regardless of whether God's outside of time or not, because God said the original creation was very good, then something must have changed at the fall to ruin the original creation. And so some have suggested introducing the second law of thermodynamics at the fall, which I explained why that doesn't really make sense in episode 6. And then some go further than that and make a better case and say, well, it wasn't the second law that God introduced at episode 6, but rather prior to the fall, God was miraculously preventing certain things from happening in the physical world prior to the fall, and then He removed His sustaining power when Adam and Eve sinned and allowed creation to degrade at that point. I made additional arguments why I do not believe that. So this claim that God called the original creation very good and therefore could not have included death and decay in the original creation depends, I think, on a humanist definition of good and evil, or a humanist definition of morality. Humanism is based on the standard of human flourishing. If something contributes to human flourishing, it is good. If something is detrimental to human flourishing, it is bad. And therefore, if God was using a humanist definition of good and bad when he said this statement after creation was over, then absolutely it would mean what most young earth creationists say it means. That is, that there could not have been any death or decay included in the original creation. However, we know that God is not a humanist, and it's highly unlikely he was using a humanist definition of good when he said creation was very good. In fact, we know that God's understanding of good can include just punishments for sin. And many of these punishments for sin, in fact, the main punishment for sin is death. The wages of sin is death. If that's a just punishment for sin, according to Christian theology, then that is certainly detrimental to human flourishing. And therefore, God does not use a humanist definition of good and evil. So when God says the original creation is very good, I do not believe he is using a humanist definition. And therefore, the original creation could have included something like just punishments for sin, up to and including death itself, possible in the original creation, in anticipation of Adam and Eve's sin in Genesis 3. But again, I just felt I needed to address that specific argument because I didn't include it in my discussion in episode 6. But obviously, this is an interesting topic, and if you want to see the rest of what I have to say on it, you have to go back and watch episode 6. Another thing that came up in episode 6 was in part 21 of Craig's video series. He addresses a question from the audience that asks if the fruit from the tree of life was some kind of magic fruit in the story. As we've discussed previously, Craig was trying to build the case that the story of the fall was mythical in nature, and in support of this added the claim that the fruit from the tree of life, because it appears to give you eternal life when you eat it, it must be some kind of magic fruit, and therefore the story must be mythical. And I said in episode 6 that I do not believe that this was any kind of magical fruit, that it was probably a physical mechanism. Now, at the time, I knew what I was thinking, but I was running out of time, frankly, in that episode, and I didn't really have time to explain what I was thinking. But I realized most people probably would not immediately get what I was thinking. Even people who have an education in biochemistry would probably not have immediately understood what I meant by that. So I'm going to explain. So what you see here is a graphic representation of an enzyme called succinate dehydrogenase. It's in all of your cells right now. In fact, many, many copies in all of your cells. You'll see down here, this is the mitochondrial membrane, and that's where succinate dehydrogenase is located. So mitochondria is the organelle in your cells that produces energy. It's been called the battery of your cells, basically. It's also been called by George Lucas a midi-chlorian. And that is the last time you'll ever hear that word from me. So succinate dehydrogenase is an enzyme, and it's also a protein. So a protein is what comes from your DNA. Your DNA makes proteins, and it's one of the reasons why DNA is so important. The coding regions of your DNA code for a specific sequence of small molecules called amino acids. It strings them together like a chain of Christmas lights, and that folds up according to its specific sequence of different amino acids. It folds up in a very specific three-dimensional shape that you see here. So this green part up on top is one subunit or one amino acid chain that is in a specific shape. And you'll see these little curlicues, those are called alpha helixes. Then there are 3 more subunits, the lavender, the baby blue, and the yellow subunits. Those are also proteins. So there's 4 different subunits, 4 different amino acid chains that all bind together to form one protein, which is in this case, this is succinate dehydrogenase. Now there's a specific kind of protein called an enzyme, which is involved in catalyzing chemical reactions. So not all proteins are enzymes, but this one is. And in this case, succinate dehydrogenase actually catalyzes 2 reactions. The first one is succinate up here, which is another small molecule, which is not shown. It's just labeled. Succinate enters the active site of the enzyme up here and comes out as fumarate, a different small molecule, a chemical reaction included in the citric acid cycle, which is how your cells change the food that you eat, the energy that you eat in chemicals in your food, and change it into energy that your cells can use, mostly in the form of a molecule called ATP. And this is a reaction that's in that process that changes basically glucose from your food into ATP. The second reaction down here is ubiquinone to ubiquinol. It's part of the electron transport chain. These E minuses you see are representing electrons. It's part of another very important biochemical pathway called the electron transport chain. And so that makes succinate dehydrogenase an enzyme, a specific kind of protein that catalyzes reactions. Now you'll also see other molecules here which are represented physically. If you see the green and blue hexagons here, and it's attached to another small molecule here, and you'll see one here and here, unless that's part of a protein. Anyway, this one down here is a heme cofactor. These are small molecules that do not come from your DNA. They're not made from your DNA. They're not chains of amino acids. These small molecules are part of most enzymes, and they're called cofactors. And so what's a cofactor? Well, cofactor is a small molecule that's part of your diet. Usually you eat it. And if these enzymes and other kinds of proteins don't have these cofactors, they don't work and they don't do their job. You can have this entire huge protein complex that's made and just sitting there and doing nothing. It doesn't have cofactors that it needs. Now, some of these cofactors your body can synthesize and make from constituent parts, but some of them your body cannot make. These are called essential, usually. If you need to eat certain vitamins and minerals, and that's basically what vitamins and minerals are, is they're cofactors. If you need to eat them, they are essential, and if you don't eat them, you don't get them, and your body can't perform those functions that require those cofactors. Okay, so what you eat in your diet is very important towards your health and towards how your body functions. In this particular enzyme, the cofactor up here is called riboflavin, or vitamin B2. And it's considered an essential vitamin, I believe. Now, many of the vitamins, especially the B series, can be modified into different vitamins, but at some point you have to eat them, and some of them are essential. A particular vitamin that we can't synthesize is called vitamin C. And we get it by eating fruit generally, or fruit products. So you'll see now where I'm going with this. What is the fruit from the tree of life? Why is it the case that Adam and Eve had to eat it to live forever, and when God kicked them out of the garden, they could no longer eat the fruit from the tree of life, and then they were aging and dying at that point? Well, we don't know what was in the fruit from the tree of life, and we also don't know what types of genetic information was in Adam and Eve's genome. But I think there is a plausible scenario where Adam and Eve had proteins similar to this one that did specific functions in their bodies, which required certain cofactors, again unknown, that they could only get from the fruit from the tree of life. And once they no longer had access to these vitamins and minerals, unknown vitamins and minerals from the fruit from the tree of life, their body could no longer perform certain specific functions. And as a result, they began to degrade and age and die. Okay. Now, unfortunately, we'll probably never be able to demonstrate this or prove it, because after a certain amount of time, especially if you're not using a specific sequence of genetic information, if it's not being used or it's not contributing to your life, in this case, it would not be contributing because of a lack of cofactors or vitamins and minerals from your diet. Those sequences are likely to disappear from the genome. They're likely to degrade and no longer eventually be deleted. So what I would hypothesize as a plausible scenario is that Adam and Eve had several mechanisms that we don't know what they were, that were performed by proteins, perhaps even enzymes like this one, in their bodies that prevented aging completely. And in fact, we have some idea of what type of functions might have been performed this way, which I'll get into next episode. But they lost a particular number of functions which was planned by God in advance and designed to be a consequence of not having access to the tree of life anymore. And so God was able to basically limit what Adam and Eve's bodies could accomplish in preventing aging. And therefore, by banishing them from the garden, he was banishing them to physical death over time. So here is a chart showing the biblical chronology in Genesis 5 and 11. You'll see the green section here is the time until that Genesis records until they had their son. It's not necessarily their first son or their only son. In fact, it says they had other sons and daughters, but it's the time, how old they were when they had their next son, that's recorded in the genealogy. So Adam was 130 years when he had Seth. Seth was 105 years when he had Enos, etc., etc., etc. So the green length is time until they had their son. That's recorded. And then the blue extent is the rest of their lifespan. So there are several things to explain about Genesis 5 and 11, namely, to physically explain, scientifically understand. Why were Adam and Eve immortal prior to the fall? Why did they begin to age and physically die after the fall? Why are human lifespans relatively stable at around 950 some years prior to the flood? Why do their lifespans begin to degrade dramatically after the flood? Those are questions I'm all going to get into next episode. But I think my point of view is pretty unique because of how I understand what happened at the fall. So with the fruit from the tree of life, human beings would live forever. Without them, it appears they would live to be around 900 some years. So there's some specific mechanisms that are preventing aging from occurring entirely, that once those mechanisms are removed, human beings then live some 900 years. But then I'm going to argue that there were more mechanisms that were removed or disappeared after the flood that caused this another dramatic decline in lifespan. So we're going to talk about that more next time.